Another danger of the hour was the melting away of the Confederate Army under the very eyes of its commanders. The record showed that there were 100,000 absentees, and though the wrathful officials of the Bureau of Conscription labeled them all deserters, the term covered great numbers who had gone home to share the suffering of their families. Such, in brief, was the fateful background of the congressional attack upon the administration in January 1865. Secretary Seldom, himself a Virginian, believing that he was the main target of the hostility of the Virginia delegation, insisted upon resigning. Davis met this determination with firmness, not to say infatuation, and in spite of the congressional crisis, exhausted every argument to persuade Seldom to remain in office. He denied the right of Congress to control his cabinet, but he was finally constrained to allow Seldom to retire. The bitterness inspired by these attempts to coerce the President may be gauged by a remark attributed to Mrs. Davis. Speaking of the action of Congress in forcing upon him the new plan for a single commanding general of all the armies, she is said to have exclaimed, "I think I am the proper person to advise Mr. Davis, and if I were he, I would die or be hung before I would submit to the humiliation." Nevertheless, the President surrendered to Congress. On January 26, 1865, he signed the bill creating the office of Commanding General and at once bestowed the office upon Lee. It must not be supposed, however, that Lee himself had the slightest sympathy with the congressional cabal which had forced upon the President this reorganization of the Army. In accepting his new position, he pointedly ignored Congress by remarking, "I am indebted alone to the kindness of His Excellency the President for my nomination to this high office." The popular clamor for the restoration of Johnson had still to be appeased. Disliking Johnson and knowing that the opposition was using a popular general as a club with which to beat himself, Davis hesitated long, but in the end yielded to the inevitable. To make the reappointment himself, however, was too humiliating. He left it to the new commander-in-chief, who speedily restored Johnson to command. While these factions, despite their disagreements, were making valiant efforts to carry on the war, other factions were stealthily cutting the ground from underneath them. There were two groups of men ripe for dissatisfaction: original Unionists, unreconciled to the Confederacy, and indifferentists, conscripted against their will. History has been unduly silent about these disaffected men. At the time, so real was the belief in state rights that contemporaries were reluctant to admit that any Southerners, once his state had seceded, could fail to be loyal to its commands. Nevertheless, in considerable areas, such as, for example, as East Tennessee, the majority remained to the end openly for the Union, and there were large regions in the South to which until quite recently the eye of the student had not been turned. They were like deep shadows under mighty trees on the face of a brilliant landscape. When the peasant Unionists who had been forced into the army deserted, however, he found in these shadows a nucleus of desperate men ready to combine with him in opposition to the local authorities. Thus were formed local bands of free companions who pillaged the civilian population. The desperadoes whom the deserters joined have been described by Professor Dodd as the neglected byproducts of the old regime. They were broken white men, or the children of such, of the sort that under other circumstances have congregated in the slums of great cities. Though the South lacked great cities, nevertheless it had its slums, a widespread slum scattered among its swamps and forests. In these fastnesses were the lowest of the poor whites, in whom hatred of the dominant whites and vengeful malice against the Negro burned like slow fires. When almost everywhere the countryside was stripped of its fighting men, these wretches emerged from their swamps and forests like the Paris rabble emerging from its dens at the opening of the Revolution. But unlike the Frenchmen, they were too sodden to be capable of ideas. Like predatory wild beasts, they ravaged themselves upon the society that had cast them off, and with utter heartlessness they smote the now defenseless Negro. In the old days, with the country well policed, the slaves had been protected against their fury. But war now changed all. The Negro villages, or streets as the term was, were without arms and without white police within call. They were ravaged by these marauders night after night, and Negroes were not the only victims, for in remote districts even murder of the whites became a familiar horror. The anti-war factions were not necessarily, however, users of violence. There were some men who cherished a dream which they labeled Reconstruction, and there were certain others who believed in separate state action, still clinging to the illusion that any state had in its power to escape from war by concluding a separate peace with the United States. Yet neither of these illusions made much headway in the states that had borne the strain of intellectual leadership. Virginia and South Carolina, though seldom seeing things eye to eye and finally drifting in opposite directions, put but little faith in either Reconstruction or separate peace. Their leaders had learned the truth about men and nations. They knew that life is a grim business. They knew that war had unloosed passions that had to spend themselves and that could not be talked away. But there was scattered over the Confederacy a population which lacked experience of the world, and which included, in the main, those small farmers and semi-peasants who under the old regime were released from the burden of taxation and at the same time excluded from the benefits of education. Among these people, the illusion of the higher classes were reflected without the ballast of mentality, ready to fight on any provocation, yet circumscribed by their own nature, not understanding life, unable to picture to themselves different types and conditions. These people were as prone as children to confuse the world of their own desire with the world of fact. When hardship came, when taxation fell upon them with a great blow, when the war took a turn that necessitated imagination for its understanding and faith for its pursuit, these people, with childlike simplicity, immediately became panic-stricken. Like the similar class in the North, they had measureless faith in talk. Hence for them, as for Horace Greeley and many another, sprang up the notion that if only their sort could be brought together for talk, and yet more talk, the Union could be reconstructed just as it used to be, and the cruel war would end.